Hello, everybody. Erev Tov, good evening or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. And this is our weekly Zoom event and the third in a series that we've been doing on different aspects of Menachem Begin's legacy and thinking. For those of you who are new to this, I'm going to speak to our guest for about half an hour and then open it up to your questions, which you can type into the chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you can write those in at whatever point you want, and I will choose a selection of those to put to our speaker. I do want to say just before I introduce him and our topic that for those of you who are not in Jerusalem, it is snowing here. If I look out of my window, there is, for Israel at least, quite thick snow gathering. And the reason that's significant is because if for that reason I'm not in my usual place at the Begin Center, I'm in my home because the Israel basically, or Jerusalem, sort of closes down once it starts snowing. So I hope that my internet connection will be okay. So just to let you know, in case things get a little bit wobbly, but hopefully that'll be okay. And also, there's a small chance, if you listen very carefully, you might hear one of my children protesting going to bed. But I am in a part of the house as far away as possible from them, so hopefully that will not happen. But if you do, then just try and tune it out. I will be. Our guest is Yisrael Medad, who is a research fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, after serving as the Director of Information Resources at the Center for 17 years. He's deputy editor of a forthcoming English edition of Zev Jabotinsky's writings. He previously served as parliamentary aide to MK Geula Cohen and was also director of Israel's Media Watch. Yisrael Medad is someone who I've known for a long time, in all the time that I've been working at the Begin Center, and he's someone that not just outside the center, but also within the center, we are all frequently learning from because of his expertise. And we're all going to benefit from that today as we talk about a very significant and I think consequential part of Menachem Begin's legacy, which is his belief in the integrity of the homeland, in the belief that all of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, belongs to the Jewish people, and therefore his opposition to partition of the land. So, without further ado, Yisrael Medad, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, Yisrael, you're muted. Yisrael, you're muted.
Hey.
Okay.
Sorry.
Now we can hear you.
Now we can hear you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope everybody enjoys.
Great. So let's just start off with the general question and I think an important historical question. I think many on this call will know that Jabotinsky and then Menachem Begin opposed a partition of the land, unlike Chaim Weizmann and ultimately Ben Gurion as well. But how integral to Jabotinsky's Zionism, to revisionist Zionism, was this idea of shlemut moledet, of territorial integrity, and why was it something that seemingly they weren't willing to compromise on?
Well, there are two parts to my answer. The first would be that. And when I mention Jabotinsky, I hope the people take into consideration that's 99.5% also Begin. In terms of their thinking and their outline, at least until the middle 60s, we could say that they were in line. So I'm going to just take that into consideration, ladies and gentlemen. The Jabotinsky concept of Zionism, of course, was not religious in the sense that we know it today. but it was very cultural. I would even say anthropological and based on Jewish history. So therefore, especially in an article he wrote in 1903, if Jews are nationalists, among other things, that means that the land of Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people. It's where the Jewish psyche, if I can use the word, was fashioned. And therefore, it's a reflection of the hills and the valleys and who walked the land and who spoke at the land and what was built here 3,000 years ago. And so without that, we are less Jewishly nationalistic. He did use religious frameworks actually for economics, like the Yovel and other ideas. But I could also say that he and Begin viewed the national idea of the Jewish people as in the land of Israel, and one cannot divide the land of Israel. You can yield it up, you can withdraw from it, but in the sense of the hope that it will always be whole, that's the background of the idea. One further point quickly, Begin, more than Jabotinsky, stressed the legal side of it, meaning that the League of Nations in 1922 chopped off eastern Eretz Yisrael, what we call historic Palestine today, which was wrong because the Zionists always held that the land of Israel is on both banks of the Jordan River. So that's my first response to your question.
Okay, so this is important, I think, for people to understand that initially when we talk about Palestine or the land of Israel or what became the mandate of Palestine, we're talking about what is now Israel, including the disputed territories in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and also what is now the Kingdom of Jordan, right? That they were all part of that territory, and then it was only later when the British sort of lopped off the land to the east of the Jordan to create what was called then Transjordan as a new, essentially a new country, a new state for their Hashemite Arab allies. Is that's basically right? Yes. Yes,
that's correct. I would even add, especially now, without trying to be too anachronistic, is that there was no Transjordan existing at that time. It was all Ottoman territory. And Jabotinsky especially, and Begin following him, said, what is Transjordan? It's an artificial entity.
Right.
It was made up to help the British and the French draw the boundaries to everybody's satisfaction.
Right. But how did this play out then in the Zionist movement? Because obviously the revisionist movement was a minority within the Zionist movement. It was ultimately dominated by the labor Zionists and Ben-Gurion, who did accept the principle of partition. So can you tell us a little about how this sort of played out in the Zionist movement, in the sort of disputes within the Zionist movement around all of the land versus a willingness to compromise on it?
Well, let's start at the beginning. And I think I gave you a map of 1919.
Yeah.
What happened in 1919? Paul hopefully put it up. The Zionist movement delegation came to the Versailles Peace Conference in Versailles, and they put on the table a map. This is the Zionist organization demand. And as you can see, it includes territory on both sides of the Jordan River. This is Chaim Weizmann. This is not quote unquote, the extremist Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky or any of his followers.
Right.
The line was drawn up into the Hejaz railway line, as the people who are looking at it can see. But even, I think it was Lord George also said, what are the boundaries of the land of Israel from the Dan to Beersheba? He also had like a biblical concept of it. And the second, not photo, but illustration I could ask Paul to put up was a decision made at the 1923 Zionist Congress. Okay, the Zionist Congress, not Jabotinsky only, but everybody at the Congress voted for a resolution that said that the land of Israel, the Jewish homeland, is on both sides, both on the east and the west of Palestine, out of historical, geographical, and cultural underpinnings. And it is our hope that the legitimate aim, or the territorial aim of the Jewish people, will be on both banks. So it is true that almost everybody in the Zionist movement was willing to agree to partition, especially the 37 one. Not all. In fact, actually, some very extreme left-wing groups, like Machanot Olim and even Hashomer Hatzaiyah, were very most against it for a different reason. They wanted one huge state for both Jews and Arabs together. But we're running ahead of ourselves. I just wanted to point that out to the people, to the audience, that nowadays, of course, we say, oh, Jabotinsky, Begin, and both banks of the Jordan, what a bunch of fanatics. At that time, the territorial issue was, at least until 37, was much more widespread, shall we say.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because especially today, when for the last 30 years, I guess, or almost 30 years, the concept of a two-state solution and a Palestinian state has been the sort of accepted international solution to the conflict. And so it's very easy to forget that not only was opposition to a Palestinian state basically consensus in Israel until not long before that, but also that the Begin idea of the right of the Jewish people to all of the land of Israel was widely shared in the Zionist movement for much of the time up to the creation of the state. Would that be fair?
Very, very fair. It was always a practical or pragmatic politics.
Right.
To say that Jabotinsky and then Begin were much more ideologically committed to the idea. How Jabotinsky would have reacted to 1947-48, we do not know.
Of course.
We do know that Begin slowly but surely began to sort of, can I use the word fudge, his statements on the integrity of the homeland. And basically it whittled down to the last phrasing of it in when he was prime minister at the time was basically, there shall not be a foreign government in the land of Israel, which he meant, well, of course, was not Transjordan. It was only what we call today Judea, Samaria, and Israel. And for example, quickly that popped into my mind, he was very adamant that there'd be no Egyptian presence in Gaza, no police. At the Camp David Accords, there would be only civilian presence. He tried to get Israeli officers in, but Egypt wouldn't agree. So there was a standoff. But you could see even there that his ideological background was trying to make sure that even a symbolic issue like that would not be given in.
Right. And just to go back to the historical account, why did this whole issue of the land and the Jewish right to the land, why did it become important with vis-a-vis the Arabs, as well as interacting with the British authorities?
My thinking would be, from reading both Jabotinsky and early Begin, they really honestly believed, at least until 1939, that the majority of the nation of Israel would come to the land of Israel. And there wasn't enough room. Remember, we're talking about the 20s and 30s, and you had to be a little bit of a visionary to see what we now view in Israel in terms of high rises and room and all sorts of things that are being done here. At that time, the country was very empty still, relatively speaking, a lot of desert. But Jabotinsky Zionism was also motivated what he called the anti-Semitism of things, in which he knew that the Jewish people could not last long. No, not too many people really took seriously a Holocaust. Pogroms and increased pogroms, yes. But everybody was talking about, even Jabotinsky, a 10-year plan to get, 1 million Jews to the land of Israel. And there wasn't enough room. Besides all that I said earlier about the religious, cultural, anthropological idea, Begin, of course, was much more concerned because from 36, 37, he was very much involved in illegal immigration. And he was actively trying, in fact, 2 weeks or even less before World War II broke out, he was in the south of Poland on the border with Romania trying to get 1,200 illegal immigrants, quote unquote, Betarim, members of the Beta movement, across the border into Romania. So the last thing he remembered coming back to Warsaw and then fleeing to Vilna was 1,200 Jews stuck on the border of Poland and they couldn't get in.
Right.
So they were talking about room. They wanted the land of Israel to be whole also for that reason.
Right. And I guess when we think about Jabotinsky, who died in 1940, we can also, I think, say that he's looking at Europe with all the millions of Jews in Europe and seeing a scenario in which the vast majority of those Jews need somewhere to run to, and you need a large area for them to run to, and he didn't envisage, or he couldn't have known, rather, that by the time the state of Israel was formed, 6 million of Europe's Jews would have been exterminated.
Yes, and reading up for tonight's dialogue between you and me, I managed to find out that in March, I think, of 1966, he was challenged at a Chilut convention. Menachem Begin, by Ehud Olmert and Shmuel Tamia, who were breaking away from Chilut, and they wanted him to get rid of this integrity of the homeland idea. And he said, no, we won't, because war could break out tomorrow or in a couple of years. And if not me, then my son, if not my son, my granddaughter will live to see the land of Israel complete under Israeli control. This is, 1 year before 67.
Wow.
Which, of course, explains another reason why Menachem Begin jumped into the public consciousness as a result of that war, but that's another issue.
Right. So before I ask another question, I want to urge people to start writing questions into the chat so that so I can go to your questions and Yisrael isn't just responding to me. So let's sort of get to so you just mentioned obviously this was in 66 that what you're just referring to. 67 is the 6-Day War, and Israel takes control of the historic and biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, which we don't need to go into politics now, of course, but as everyone knows, becomes the big political debate in Israel between right and left. But certainly for Menachem Begin, it's the realization of that idea of the integrity of the homeland, And also, I guess, not just the integrity of the homeland, but that the places that the Jewish people return to as a result of that are the places that are, with the exception of Jerusalem, of course, are the places that are part of the biblical Israel, of Beit El and Shiloh, where you're speaking to us from, right, and Shechem and those sorts of places. So is there, to what extent is Begin's connection, I don't want to say religious, but to what extent is it biblical? Is it connected to the 3,000 year or whatever connection of the Jewish people, beyond other things like security and all the things that we tend to talk about now?
Well, first of all, and if I forget, you remind me what the question was, a personal recollection. I happened to be studying at what we call the Menachem Begin here in Israel for the 67 year. And I was doing my agricultural work, as we call it in Hebrew, Hachshara, at a place called Amatzia. And during the week of the war, when we weren't on guard duty or sitting in a foxhole, listening to the radio, I remember, the news reports coming over that week and the following week. Now we can go to Shiloh, now we can go to Beit El, now we can go to Hebron. And like they were having programs teaching people what these places were. And I had been a member of Beitar. And for me, it was quite knowledgeable what these places were. That's what we learned in our youth movement activities. So I'm looking around at some of my other friends on the Machon a little bit later on, and they knew nothing or next to nothing, okay? And for me, it was very familiar, and that just gives you personal view of the difference between someone who followed Jabotinsky and Begin and other people. Begin has been accused by some of his critics as altering the secular Jabotinsky because he came, Begin, from a much more religious background, shall we say, family-wise. But still, I would have to say that Begin was a true Jabotinskyite in the sense of what is the concept of a national homeland? So you look at the history, you look where your people live, you look where they wrote their prophecies and what they wrote their books, and you go to the Bible and it says Shiloh and it says Beit El and it says Hebron. This is not foreign territory. Right. Even someone like Tzachi Hanegbi, okay, who went out of Likud and came back into Likud, his autobiography is a quote from the Maccabee theme, "Not a foreign land did we take." I remember arguments in Beitar about what about Sinai? Why is Begin giving up Sinai, for example? And the only true answer that I was able to give was that Sinai wasn't recognized by the League of Nations as the Jewish national homeland. Gaza was, Judea was, Samaria was. Technically, Transjordan was supposed to be in it, but Jewish settlement, as the phrase was postponed in that area. Even though even Chaim Weizmann in the 1930s was active in buying land in Transjordan. And so I think I could end off this point, but if you could put up the last illustration we have. Many people probably watching have seen Arab propaganda in which they show how Palestine was reduced. Of course, they never had a Palestine, but that's another question. Here, I managed to find revisionist literature, which shows that in 1918?
18, yeah.
Right. It was both sides of the Jordan. That's the famous map that even the Irgun adopted. In 1922, Transjordan was lopped off. In 1937, There was the first partition, 38 was the Woodhead partition. And in 1939, the white paper said, no Jewish home. It's a Palestine. And in 10 years, we'll decide whether it's a Jewish country or an Arab country according to demographics. So here you have an example of revisionist thinking versus Arab propaganda today.
Very interesting. I'm going to ask one more question before I turn to questions from the audience. Can you tell us something about? I mean, we've in the first of these discussions that I've been having, I spoke to our old friend, our mutual friend Moshe Fuchsman, about the Ma'apach, about his new book, about the coming to power of Begin and the changes that were made. And he was talking primarily, he mentioned settlement in Judea and Samaria, but he was talking more about socioeconomic policy. But obviously, when Begin came to power, it made a huge difference to, there was a sort of overnight, or you can tell me if I'm right on this, I'm assuming, an overnight sort of change in policy from the previous Labour government about settlement in Judea and Samaria. Because though there had been settlements built, there was a lot of sort of the Labour government seemed to always have a sort of making up its mind whether it was going to support or not support, or Rabin was opposed and Perez was in favor, and all these things that were going on. And then suddenly you had a government that came in under Begin that was wholeheartedly backing the settlement movement. Would that be a fair representation? And what was how would you describe that change that took place?
Well, we always have a number of labor Zionist cynics that said Cherut and Begin talk a lot, but they don't do much. We had communities along the Jordan River. We put up communities in the Rafiach salient, as it was called. We reestablished Gush Etzion. But then again, their ideology was where there's less demographic of the Arabs, we can put Jews. Right. Begin was different. And he never had full power to do what he wanted to do. Let's be fair, with all the criticism that he could have done more. He never really had a strong enough coalition backing to do what he wanted to do, but he spoke differently. As an example, I'll use my own home village, Shiloh. Famously, when he went to the United States in his first visit and was asked about the settlements, he told the story how he said to President Carter, I looked up the Gazette in of the United States and I found 8 Shilohs. Now, you, President Carter, would not disavow or prohibit Jews from living there. He said, how can I prevent Jews from living in the original Shiloh? And this was on NBC or Meet the Press. I think it was NBC. Anyway, the program was Meet the Press. So he spoke in a totally different semantic framework, that this is our homeland, Jerusalem is our eternal capital. He would wax eloquent, of course, but he was very sympathetic. His very famous statement, I think it was a couple of days after the elections in 1977, there will be many Elonei Moreh. We never had complete satisfaction, can I say, as representing people living on the other side, on this side of the Green Line. But I can confirm what your premise was, a vast difference in the approach, in the attitude, I would even say in the atmosphere in talking about that. Just say something against the land of Israel, and Begin bristled.
Right, and my reading of it is that with the previous Labour governments from 67 to 77, when Begin came in, as you said, the settlements were built in areas very specific areas that were part of sort of along the lines of the Elon plan, which had at its heart a kind of a sort of security rationale, whereas Begin didn't just talk in terms of security. He talked about, as you say, about it being the Jewish homeland, about it being the historic and spiritual homeland of the Jewish people, which is very different, right?
Absolutely. He did not neglect security. I remember talks about the fact that everybody thought Jordan was the weakest Arab country going on, and who knows if Iraq could take over, and then the border of a very anti-Israel and Zionist country would be on the Jordan River rather than the king, the little king, as we used to call him then. But for him, it was a matter of deep ideological, cultural, historic recognition that the Jewish people are one, are whole, our culture and our religious traditions are one, and the land of Israel is one as well.
Right. Okay. So let's thank you very much, firstly, and let's go to questions. Some of the questions that have come in, and I'm going to ask people to keep writing those in. There's a question from Robin about the evacuation of Yamit in the Sinai, and obviously the big, that first big pushback that he got from his own side of the aisle was in connection with the peace agreement with Egypt and opposition from some in his own party, including, of course, your old boss Gula Cohen, member of Knesset Gula Cohen, who opposed the evacuation from Sinai. And Robin asks, could Yamit have been seen as part of Gaza and not Sinai, and therefore not evacuated, or an argument be made that it not be evacuated?
For Begin, the short answer is no. As we saw in one of the maps previously of cis and trans Jordan, Begin was a legalist. That everybody knows. And he said the international line of legal sanctions would be the line just along the Rafiq border going down to Eilat. And Yamit was on the wrong side. He was criticized by some of the more activist left-wingers who were in the Land of Israel movement at the time, both from the labor, even Mapam, and what we used to call the Achdut Avodah section.
Right, like Tabenkin, people like that, right?
Tabenkin, right, and other people. Look, Sinai has oil. We're giving up the oil fields. Why can't we say give up half of Sinai? Why do we have to give up all? So that was, I'm talking personally, very disappointing that he could be so boxed into his own theories of legality. So in the 50s and 60s, it worked by saying Transjordan should belong to Israel, and certainly Judea and Samaria, what the Hashemites called the West Bank. And then when we do have Sinai, for example, it goes the other way. That was a disappointment, but to explain his thinking, that was his thinking, as far as I can tell. That's what the letters to Sadat, one of the books I edited with Harry Horowitz, the late Harry Horowitz, on the personal correspondence, basically reflect that type of analysis.
That's really interesting, because last week, or 2 weeks ago, actually, we spoke to Dan Murray-Dorr about the idea of Begin's commitment to the rule of law, and I guess that also fits in with his thinking in terms of, or in a very legalistic way about those issues as well. That's really interesting. But just staying with that for a minute, just staying with the Egypt deal for a minute. Begin said afterwards that how difficult that decision had been, to sign that deal, which meant giving up Sinai. Was it? Do you think he said that purely or mainly because it meant all those people living in Yamit having to leave their homes, or did he have some sort of attachment to Sinai, or was it just not like that because Sinai wasn't part of Eretz Yisrael?
Look, to be fair to the subject and not to Begin at this moment, he was the one who said, "I wanted to be buried not buried, but live in
to retire there." Right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. In one of those communities, and so I think he got carried away with himself sometimes, which is also a problem of speakers rather than doers. But I have no doubt, and I'm not going to say that I was intimate with Begin, but I did know him very well to a certain extent. And he did feel very bad. In fact, I would even go so far, and it's not a new thing, he sacrificed Sinai to a certain extent in order to keep Judea and Samaria.
Right.
And he tried to keep Gaza. So that is also the consideration. Again, which is more important? For him, Judea and Samaria, I think both, not only historically and culturally, but security-wise, in terms of the missiles and mountain range and stuff like that, was much more important to him than Sinai. And that's also, you have to figure that into the equation of what was Begin thinking about on that surrender and territorial withdrawal.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Shmuel Yerushalmi has a question, which is it's on a slightly different. It's coming from a slightly different direction, I guess. He wants to ask, in your view, what was the relation of Menachem Begin to world anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist movements?
Begin, like Jabotinsky, were not enamored at all of these type of movements. Both Begin and Jabotinsky negated communism, less because of its economic structure than the fact that the whole idea behind it was that there are no nationalities.
Right.
There are only classes, and classes cut across nationalities. Both of the gentlemen were very strong believers in nationalities or nationalism, because for them, every people had a uniqueness, whether it's language, whether it's historical memory, whether it's cultural output, books, poems, customs, and to wipe those away is to deny a person's literally a freedom to be who he is. And therefore they thought communism, and I presume what I could call anti-imperialistic movements and stuff like that, if that's my understanding of the question, would be very oppressive of the individual, and deny him his identity as part of a different community, which had different values than simply economic ones. That's the best I can do on that one.
Sure. And of course, Begin suffered firsthand at the hands of Soviet communism, being in a labor camp, and being tortured by the NKVD. There's just a follow up here from Svi Berg on the Yamit question. He asks, I guess it's kind of almost the opposite of the previous question, which is the previous question asked whether Yamit could have been part of Gaza. He asks whether Gaza could have been part of Sinai and returned to Egypt rather than remaining under Israeli control. Whether that was on the table and if Begin would have supported it.
Well, not only for Begin, for many other people. You have to remember that Gaza had a small, but a Jewish population up until 1929. Many people, of course, in remembering the 1929 riots, think about either Jerusalem or more specifically Hebron, or Tzfat, Safed. But the Jews were living in Gaza and had to get out of town very quickly. They were merchants that had come from Jaffa in the 1890s, and they moved to Gaza.
Right.
In 1947-48, we had a kibbutz, religious kibbutz in Gaza, Kfar Aza, as it was known then. Then it became Kfar Darom. And it was part of the mandate. I mean, Yitzhak Rabin, when he was arrested as a member of the Palmach in 46, he ended up with about 2,000 other members of the Palmach in the Rafiach detention camp. So Gaza was part of the mandate, and it wasn't only for Begin or the revisionists. So, and in 1956-57, there was a 3.5 month military governorship of Gaza as part of Israel. You have to look at that background to understand that Gaza would not be considered part of Sinai.
Okay. Sheldon Lerman reminds us about the Golan, which we haven't mentioned, and the fact that although both the left and the right agreed that for security reasons that we should hold on to the Golan and settle there, it was Begin who passed the law extending Israeli sovereignty to the Golan. Where did that impetus come from Begin to pass that law?
Don't forget that in the 1880s and 90s, Jews were purchasing property on the Golan. It was only in 1924 that the French and British finalized the delineation of the borders between Mandate Palestine and Mandate Syria, Lebanon,
right,
which gave Golan over to the French, for the French giving Mosul and its oil to Britain. In other words, the Zionists played nothing here, and they were expecting, for those who remember the map, the first map we put up in 1919, the borders extended up to the Litani River and into the Golan. So that was a consciousness, not only Jabotinsky, not only Begin, but the Zionist movement, that the Golan was part of the land of Israel. We now know from archaeology, from Gamla and other places, so it's not a foreign land whatsoever.
Right.
And we just had a program this week on Israeli television about that decision and how Begin called up some of the ministers and said, we got to get together. Today we're passing a law. It was one of the few times that the Knesset actually worked less than 24 hours and passed a piece of legislation in 3 quick votes. And there are many reasons for that, but I don't think we have time for all of them. He was very conscious of the fact that there was a window of opportunity. He took it. And if I can add one more thing about Begin's eloquence, or rhetoric anyway, he called in the American ambassador after the president criticized Israel and said, "Who do you think we are? A banana republic?" I would have loved to see Sam Lewis's face at that time. I don't think any Israeli prime minister has treated an American ambassador since in any way similar.
So that question, that answer actually can be a nice segue into a question by Aaron Brownstein, who asks to talk about American policy, American attitude. He says in 1981-82, President Reagan stated that Jewish settlement is, quote, not illegal, thus changing the Carter position. This has still been a seesaw in US politics since. Can you elaborate?
Well, to elaborate, we basically briefly say that American policy was changed during the Carter period. And it was helped along by, if I'm not mistaken, a Jewish State Department lawyer who finagled out of international law the concept that Israel is an occupier, or should I say an illegal occupier. It's a legal occupier. And the issue of illegal occupation, of course, goes against all that you and I have been discussing about Begin and Jabotinsky previously, about the historical connection of the Jewish people with the land of Israel, which means the heartland, which is the Judea and Samaria. It was quite obvious to the non-Jews who wrote the League of Nations mandate that said, we're reconstituting the Jewish national home based on the historical connection of the Jewish people to the country.
Right.
Well, if the non-Jews knew that then, why can't Jews today recognize the fact that at least we are not illegal occupiers here? This is the homeland. And Reagan knew it. I don't know the background of his statement. In other words, who was whispering in his ear. I do know that I think her name has just slipped my mind, the former Secretary of State.
From when?
Madeleine.
Madeleine Albright.
What?
Madeleine Albright?
Madeleine Albright also admitted in a television interview that the question isn't the legality of it, but something else.
Right.
And this all fits in. I think, in fact, we discussed this week in some of my appearances before students. I say, wait a second. You don't believe that Israel should be in the territories for this or that reason? That's one thing. You think it's immoral. You think it's undefensible. But do not say that we're there illegally. We're there very much legally. Based on all the history that we had there and the fact that it was a defensive war in 67 and the fact that there was no ever an independent Arab state in that area, and that Jordan had illegally annexed the area in 1950 after conquering it and not giving it to the Arabs of Palestine as they should have perhaps at that time in 1950. And that's a whole different kettle of fish, if I could use the phrase. You can have politics, but you must have fundamental, genuine facts on the other hand, and then fight and dispute about that, not about ideas and opinions.
Okay. So here's a question which gets into the politics a little bit from Jacqueline, who asks, if settlements were built throughout the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, according to Begin's hopes, would the Arab populations living there have become Israeli nationals / citizens with all the legal rights? And would the Arabs have accepted that arrangement?
Question A, according to Begin, yes.
Right.
They would become citizens. I don't know if he would have said immediately, after 5 years,
right.
If they'd have to go through a test of citizenship or a security test. But knowing Begin, no problem whatsoever about that, because he believed, like Jabotinsky did, that Arabs, once they recognized that Israel was here to stay, would come to terms with the Zionist Jewish state, and they would become equal citizens. According to Jabotinsky's last article on the subject in 1940, they could even become a vice or even a prime minister, because he believed in equal rights for everybody.
Right.
Question B, whether the Arabs would accept it. I don't know what Begin would say or Jabotinsky would say. Yisrael Medad would say, in my past experience of the last 60 years, getting older as I am, no. They have refused constantly not only to accept political compromises, but they refuse to recognize Jewish national identity.
Right.
And even destroying archaeological artifacts and locations. I mean, it's a quite a war of of negation
Right.
that the Arabs are carrying on, in my personal opinion.
Right.
And I don't think that would be possible.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because you could go all the way up to Netanyahu, also ultimately a student of Jabotinsky, and see that when he did somewhat reluctantly and controversially in the Likud, accept, and under pressure from the United States, accept the idea of two states. He, before any other Israeli prime minister, had this proviso on the table that they recognize not just that there's a state of Israel, but that it's the Jewish state. That Israel is the state of the Jewish people, which Mahmoud Abbas refused to do. So it's that I think speaks somewhat to what you're saying. There's a question here from Eliyahu Green. It's a little off topic, but I think he assumes, probably rightly, that you'll know the answer. He says, was there an Irish Jew who was active in both the IRA and the Jabotinsky movement called Briscoe or something similar? Are you aware of this?
Was there?
Yeah.
Yes, there was. Robert Briscoe was the mayor of Dublin, the Jewish mayor of Dublin. He was active in the IRA, gun running, and he managed to get Jabotinsky's link with the, I'm going to say it now, funnily, the political side of the IRA, with Eamon Valera and a few other people. And Briscoe was a propagandist for the revisionists at that time. In fact, I can even sneak in something else. I was approached by the BBC because, and this I can ask your help, Paul. Bloody Sunday, the 50th, is it the 50th anniversary is coming up? I think the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
72, I think, maybe, is coming up, and they're doing a film on it. And it turns out that the best documentary evidence they have, I won't go into all the details because I want to keep everybody in suspense, was done by a historian that wrote the history of the Irgun and the Lehi, called Terror Out of Zion, J. Bauer Bell. And I had drinks with Bauer Bell in a bar across from Columbia University way back when. And he told me that he was sitting in a secret location with one of the most senior IRA commanders. And on the shelf was Begin's The Revolt. And he said, not only was it odd that this book was on the shelf, but because of my knowledge of the Irgun, I knew that David Raziel and Avram Stern had written glowingly of the IRA's 1916 Easter uprising as an example of what an underground urban guerrilla group could do. So everything comes around full circle. So in addition to Briscoe, we had a few other people involved.
Right. And wasn't Yitzhak Shamir, when he was in the Lehi, Yitzhak Shamir's nom de guerre was Michael, right? After Michael Collins. Is that
right? Yeah, it was with the Hebrew, Michael, but it was after Michael Collins.
Okay, Michael, right. Okay.
I don't know if it was the Liam Neeson. What was his name?
Liam Neeson.
Right? He's very tall. Shamir was quite short.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, of course, because today the Irish Catholics, the Irish Republicans are very much pro-Palestinian.
That's because they went off into the socialist deep end.
Right. Okay. So there was another question here I wanted to put to you. I can't find it now. So let's maybe we'll end with this. when Begin left office, one of the things that was interesting about when you talked about Begin as prime minister was that he wasn't quite the prime minister that many in the settlement movement hoped he would be. Is that fair in terms of that? At least that's what I got from what you said. I mean, I think you said that he was constrained somewhat by his coalition, and so he didn't maybe do as much as he would have wanted to do, and you would have wanted him to do.
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was a parliamentary aide to Gula Cohen.
Right.
Gula Cohen was in Techia, which had split off from me. And I was active in the Knesset at that time. I started in the Knesset in 81. So I was witness to a lot of the frustrations and meetings, not only by Gula, but Yuval Ne'eman, and Rav Waldman, and Eliezer, and Eliakim Etzny, and other people that were, I said frustrated, but they chafing at the bit. They tried to push as much as possible. But again, I'm willing to admit that the prime minister has a view that not everybody else has, and is privy to information and intelligence that sometimes limits and constricts his ability to act.
Right.
He did appoint Yuval Ne'eman as the chairman or chairperson, I guess I have to say today, of this interministerial commission for settlement. And Yuval went wild. I think he managed to get like 80 communities down on paper as government decisions or semi-government decisions, which continued for the next few years. In other words, they weren't immediately established, but they were on the paper, which was Begin allowed that. But again, he was always stuck with his legalities, which even got him into trouble with the Bet Hadassah. He wasn't happy about the invasion of Bet Hadassah in 1979, if I'm not mistaken.
This is in Hebron?
In Hebron, because everybody was in Kiryat Arba, which was on the, I wouldn't say outskirts, because it's only about a 15-minute walk to get into Hebron proper, but it wasn't within the Hebron municipality. And so...
Right, Kiryat, for those that don't know, Kiryat Arba is the largest settlement that's just outside Hebron, right?
Right. It's a city. Well, I wouldn't say it's a city, but
it's a town, though.
A large town.
Yeah.
And personally, knowing Begin, he never liked to be surprised or forced into a situation. If you talked to him and reasoned with him, and he did it once, but if you went out and did something, he was difficult to deal with. Even though he joined the first Gush Emanim rallies at Sebastia and other places, which were outside his normal mode of behavior in demonstrating. He wasn't that type of a person.
Okay, very, very interesting. Okay, so I think we will leave it there. And thank Yisrael Medad very much for his time and his knowledge and enlightenment for us of this topic. Is Yisrael Medad, are there any, for those that want to know more, are there any books you can recommend on this, on this topic?
Well, if anybody's interested in the revisionist Jabotinsky movement, I would strongly suggest Lone Wolf by Shmuel Katz, right, as a historical background.
Right.
Howard Grief's book on the legal question is a heavy book, but those who can leaf through things, at least according to the index, can get knowledge. There aren't too many books in English on the whole subject of Gush Emunim or right, Jewish resettlement of Judea and Samaria. So I can't really suggest any of those. But if they drop you a line, I'm sure you'll pass it on, and I'll be able to send out perhaps to them a short bibliography of
Sure. I'll be happy to do that. For those of you on the call who are not on my mailing list, then please do email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il. I'm just writing it in the chat, and you can. I'll put you on the mailing list, and then you'll get information about all these events that we're doing in English, these Zooms, and hopefully some events in person as well at the Begin Center. And I will pass on whatever you wish me to pass on to Yisrael Medad as well. Okay, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Yisrael Medad, again. I hope you stay warm in this stormy weather we're having here. And for those of you in Jerusalem, enjoy the snow tomorrow. And I hope to see everyone next week. Bye.